Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today, I'm sharing with you a conversation I had with Martha Lundgren, the president of the board of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Arizona. And we talk all about how to plan and prepare for a funeral. And there's some really important information in this conversation, things I had no idea about. I think you'll be surprised as well at the things you'll learn when you listen in. So be sure and stay tuned. Also, if you haven't done so yet, be sure to subscribe to this channel by clicking on the button down below. And be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen. If you're so inclined, and I'd be most appreciative if you're able to make a small contribution to help keep this channel and the podcast on the air, you can go to eoluniversity.com/support. There you'll find 3 different ways you can make just a small contribution, a few dollars even, and help keep this going. And I appreciate it so much. So now we'll move on with my conversation with Martha Lundgren. Today, I'm very happy to welcome my special guest, Martha Lundgren. Martha is the president of the board of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Arizona. She volunteers through that organization, including serving on their speakers bureau and as FCAAZ's representative on the Arizona End of Life Care Partnership. And we'll be talking all about the Funeral Consumers Alliance today and what they do and how they benefit people. And you can learn more about the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Arizona at their website, which is fcaaz.org, or the National Funeral Consumers Alliance at funerals.org. So, Martha, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
I am too. And I realize that you just have a wealth of information to share. And it's something, at least, that I haven't covered very much on this podcast. So I'm really excited to talk to you, first of all, about what is the Funeral Consumers Alliance and what does it do?
Well, the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Arizona is part of a national set of affiliates that all work together through the Funeral Consumers Alliance at the national level. Each of the affiliates is a nonprofit, independent source of accurate information about cremations, funerals, and other end-of-life related topics, particularly around funerals and funeral planning, but we are sometimes involved in other aspects of this part of life.
And I know that your organization can help people just with the primary steps of planning a funeral, because most of us have never had experience with it until suddenly we're called upon to do that. So would you talk a little bit about what those steps are and what you recommend?
Sure. The first thing to do is to plan ahead, to think about this well in advance of the time that you might need to make some arrangements. And we'll talk about planning ahead versus paying in advance as we go along here, but particularly planning ahead. Think about what's important to you, what's important to your family, what's important in your cultural context. Is the idea of something that is really formal and involves a church service and involves a visitation? Are those things that are traditional in your family and important to you? Or are you someone who says, you know what, there are a lot of things I'd like to do with my money other than that, or perhaps I don't have the money for something like that, or perhaps those kinds of things are just not important to me. So am I going to think about cremation instead of burial? Am I going to think about where I want this to be? What is important to me? Is it ceremony? Is it ritual? Is it simplicity? Is it practicality? So start with what's important to you. And then when you've made some decisions about whether you want to be cremated or whether you want to be buried, whether you want to have a green burial, that's something that requires a bit more planning than other things, because there are fewer green burial cemeteries than there are what I'll refer to as a conventional cemetery. Do you live in a state where you can have your body taken care of through a process called alkaline hydrolysis, which was how Archbishop Desmond Tutu's body was, the final disposition of his body was through that process. That's recently become legal in Arizona. And in a number of states, but in Arizona, it's not available yet because they haven't gone kind of through all of the setup processes from a regulatory standpoint. And there hasn't been, to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been a facility come online just yet, but that's coming in Arizona. There's something called human composting, which is available in fewer states than alkaline hydrolysis is. But if those things are important to you, find out whether or not they're offered in the state that you live in or in a nearby state, where if the transportation cost is not an issue for you. One of the differences between cremation and alkaline hydrolysis is that the cremation has a much higher carbon footprint. Alkaline hydrolysis is a more environmentally friendly process for the final disposition of human remains. So once you have an idea of what you want and what you don't want, you're going to want to shop around. A lot of people don't even think about shopping around because it's not a purchase that they make very often. So do they even know how to shop around? There's a couple of tools that we have that make finding out what funerals cost in your area a little easier and helps you start the process. Funeral Consumers Alliance of Arizona, like many of the affiliates, publishes a price comparison report. We do ours about every 2 years. We get the general price list from all the funeral homes across the state of Arizona, and we use those to get a pretty precise cost for 3 types of services: a direct cremation, a direct burial, and a simple full funeral, so that you can go, oh, well, these 2 funeral homes that are just 2 miles down the street from each other have really similar costs, or maybe they have really dissimilar costs. And oftentimes you'll find really dissimilar costs from funeral home to funeral home. So that tool that the Funeral Consumers Alliances offer and make available to the public is a really good tool to help someone start shopping around. You're going to want to figure out. Go ahead.
I was going to say that sounds important because I would bet that most people have no idea how much a standard funeral would cost. I mean, most people who end up planning a funeral at the last minute don't even know what's reasonable or whether or not they're being overcharged. So that tool sounds really, really valuable for people.
Well, this might be a good spot to show you. Let's see here. We should be bringing up this that will show you what the extreme price differences are within 3 parts of Arizona. So Southern Arizona is essentially Tucson and down to the border. Central Arizona is, as it implies, but it's Maricopa County and Phoenix, which is the largest population part of the state, in Northern Arizona. And you can see that, for example, in Central Arizona, so in the Phoenix area, so on that first big block, a direct cremation, and I can define that for you in just a minute. The price on that varies from $545 to $3,095 for exactly the same service.
Wow, that's shocking to me. I had no idea.
And a lot of people, that's exactly the reaction that we get when we share that information. And you can see that that's similar, through all of these different categories and across the 3 different regions in the state that we divide our price comparison reports up. I can do a lot with, let's take the Central Arizona, $3,095 minus $545. That's $2,000. It's about $2,550. I can do a lot with $2,550. And when you think about when someone dies, there are a lot there's a lot of cost involved in dying. There could be, the person may have had lost wages up to the time of their death. There may have had caregiving expenses. There may be family members who need to travel, and for whom travel is not financially very easy for them to do. You may want to choose to use that some of that difference in the cost to memorialize the person. Perhaps there's a major donation that you would like to give. You may be able to afford, the Cadillac version, the Mercedes-Benz version of a funeral, but perhaps you would rather do something else with your money, or with your loved one might specify, look, don't do that, but would you, please, these are my favorite charities. These are the causes that are important to me. I would rather leave that to you than it be spent on how you take care of my body when I die. So,
Wow. So it kind of matters where you die. I mean, where you die or where you choose to get services
right,
near where you die. So, I mean, it matters a lot
right.
financially.
It really does. And in Tucson, for example, one of the most expensive funeral homes in town for direct cremation and one of the least costly in town are just about maybe 2 or 3 miles apart. And both of them are in some of the lowest income parts of the city. So just because a funeral home is located in a modest socioeconomic area doesn't mean that it's necessarily the least expensive. This is also a good time for me to say that when I talk about cost and I talk about least expensive, I'm not suggesting that people think about, well, what's cheap or what's the cheapest. It's what's economical for you, for what's important to you. It's really not being put into a position where you're spending money that you don't have, or that you would rather spend in another way related to the fact that you are going to die, or your loved one, you're taking care of a loved one who has died.
This information is so essential because I mean, it's essential if you're planning ahead and you have time to investigate. But if you're a loved one has died suddenly, you're grieving, you're in shock, and you're trying to figure out, how do we have a funeral? Who has time to survey a bunch of funeral homes in the area to find out what's the most cost effective? I would imagine so many people end up paying more than they might have wanted to pay, but just because they don't have the time or energy to do this kind of research.
Exactly, and that's one of the big benefits of having a Funeral Consumers Alliance in your area. Most states have at least one affiliate, but not every state is covered completely like we cover Arizona. There's something called information asymmetry also. And then I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about the kind of the state that you're in when you're having to do something urgent. We'll start there. So, when the refrigerator goes out just before a company is going to come and you've got a big meal planned, you've got to get a refrigerator purchased, right? And now there's some tools that make that a lot easier, and you may even be able to get it delivered without even going to the store, and you may be able to comparison shop. But it wasn't that long ago that if you needed a refrigerator in a hurry or tires in a hurry, you were going to pay whatever you could get your hands on. And that's not only similar in the funeral industry today, because in a study that the Funeral Consumers Alliance, our national organization, and the Consumer Federation of America did a couple of years ago, maybe a little more recent than that, there was only about 19% of funeral homes put their general price lists on their websites. Only 19%. So trying to comparison shop on the internet is much more difficult than it is to buy a refrigerator or tires when you have an emergency. We also know that the national chains, there are several national chains that own hundreds of funeral homes across the country, You're not going to find a general price list on the website of a national chain. I haven't found one yet. You're more likely to find them on the website of a funeral home that's locally owned. So you have this, I need to make a purchase. There's a lot writing on it because it has to be done. It has to be done quickly if you haven't planned ahead. And oh, by the way, I'm under a fair amount of emotional stress right now. And so you're really in a situation where you're not operating necessarily at the same kind of capacity as you might under other circumstances. And then you add to that information asymmetry. That's when in two parties, one of them holds a lot of information. They're really knowledgeable. They know the ins and outs. And the other person is a complete novice or doesn't have access to the information. There's a power imbalance there. There's an influence imbalance there that makes the person who has less information more vulnerable to even being manipulated sometimes. But just in the rush that they don't have the time to get themselves the education that they need to spend an amount of money that they feel comfortable with and that they can afford.
And that makes so much sense why planning ahead is really helpful when you're not in that moment of shock and grief. You can
Exactly.
kind of think clearly about, well, what would I like? What does make the most sense? And
Exactly.
you're less vulnerable to being taken advantage of. But it also seems to me a lot of people would, when they're in that moment of grief and trying to make these decisions, it doesn't feel right to say, I want to spend less money for my loved one's funeral. I mean, that a lot of people end up thinking,
Sure.
well, if I really truly love mom, I should be willing to spend all kinds of money on her funeral. And I think people get mixed up there, and
Mm-hmm.
they're much less able to make a pragmatic decision because they're making that decision out of emotion and pain.
Right. Right. I think that if mom is the kind of person who would want you to be able to breathe easily financially at the end of it, and because you've done the planning ahead, you can all be a lot more comfortable with the decisions that you make. A couple more things when it comes to planning ahead. So you do want to shop around, figure out what you can afford, and then set a budget so that you know what you really can afford and help you stick to it. There are some things you need to have and some things that you may want to have. And so if you get your baseline of what are the needs that I have taken care of, then are those additional items like whether or not you're going to put an obituary in the newspaper or if you're going to spread it through social media. I did both when my husband died. So there's some ways to be flexible, but I could have saved a fair amount of money by not having his obituary published in the newspaper. People think that embalming is a necessary item. It is rarely a necessary item. It is almost never legally required. And a funeral home is prohibited from saying that to you. They can have a policy that says if you're going to have a public viewing, the body must be embalmed. But a body that is refrigerated, it's preserved in a way that is appropriate until cremation or burial. Embalming is not required. There are some times when you're transporting a body over some distance or across state lines, sometimes you will be required to do it, but it's if it's the funeral home down the street and you're not having a public viewing and there are no special circumstances, embalming is an unnecessary expense.
That's really good to know because, again, because it's just so customary in our society, I would imagine a lot of people just assume, well, of course, my loved one will be embalmed. That has to happen.
Yeah. One of the books that I read a few years ago that was really helpful to me in making decisions that I needed to do. My husband and I had enough discussion that I had enough guidance, but he died unexpectedly One of the books that had helped me really frame my own thoughts about that is Caitlin Doughty's Smoke Gets in Your Eyes,
Mhm.
where she has a pretty frank discussion of what the various processes are and how a body is handled, whether it's going to be buried, whether it's going to be cremated, whether it's going to be embalmed, was really useful information to me. It really helped me shape my decisions along my values as to what I do and don't want for myself and what I would or would not have done to my husband's body when he died.
Mm. It is so helpful to have resources like that and guidance. Again, because most of us just don't know what steps to take. And when you talked about planning the funeral, I was wondering, my mother planned her funeral 5 years before she died and planned it down to every detail, every song that would be sung, the
Mm-hmm.
speakers who would come, everything. She picked out the flowers she wanted, the photos she wanted displayed. She planned
Mm-hmm.
every single thing. Do you recommend people get that granular in the planning, or I guess, or just a matter of taste?
So I would say it is a matter of taste, and if that's your taste, absolutely. Certainly, that can be a wonderful gift. When my mother died, it was very similar. We knew which hymns that she wanted. We knew who she wanted to be her pallbearers. We knew really all of the things that we needed to know, and she had written those down and left them where we could find them. It wasn't something that we had talked about, but she left them for us where we could easily find them. One of my siblings passed away several years ago. They knew that their death was impending. They did not leave anything for their daughter or for the rest of us, and that was really difficult. In our situation, that was really difficult because we really wanted to do what my sibling wanted, and yet we had so little to go on, and that was an extra stressor for us. Yeah.
And you mentioned that planning the funeral is not the same as, doesn't necessarily mean paying for the funeral in advance. And so I was curious about that.
Sure. So when you plan ahead, you have an opportunity to know how much you expect to have to spend, and to save the money for that. Funeral Consumers Alliance recommends that you save for your funeral, and that one way to make sure that the money is there and readily accessible is to put it in a payable on death account, naming the person that you've made responsible for taking care of your arrangements afterwards to have access to it. They won't get access to it immediately upon your death because they'll have to have, if you do a payable on death account, they'll have to have a copy of your death certificate, which can take a few days to come in. But if that person has the financial means to make the arrangements for you, then they can be reimbursed out of that. And so that's generally what we recommend. We don't recommend prepaying because it limits your flexibility in quite quite a bit. You can end up paying, if you use an insurance policy, for more in premium than you actually spend on the service. That's possible. And you no longer control that money. If you put your money in a payable on death account and you need that money for something else before you die, you have access to that money. It's yours. You still control it. The one time that we do say you may want to prepay for a funeral is if you're dealing like with a Medicaid spend down, so that if you need to have your assets below a certain amount so that you can qualify for Medicaid reimbursed services, that may be a time to do it. I have had some folks tell me though that you want to be careful about that because sometimes the spend down requirements are not as clear. They seem to shift sometimes a little bit. So I would just mention that it's not my area of expertise. in regard to prepaying, a couple of other thoughts. One is that what I've noticed on funeral homes websites and on their in their marketing materials, they will often use the word pre-plan in a way that is almost synonymous to what they're really intending is that when you prepay, you will sign a contract with them for your funeral arrangements. And so, you want to be really watchful about what does this word really mean and where is it leading me to when it comes to that. There are, I have, as a consumer rights advocate, I have some concerns about some of the marketing that's done. One of the national cremation, they refer to themselves as a society, but they're a commercial business, that cremation is the inexpensive alternative. Well, or the less expensive alternative, but their prices in Arizona for cremation are substantially higher than many of the funeral homes that offer cremation that are not part of a national chain.
So there could be deceptive advertising that consumers need to watch out for and can't necessarily trust everything that they read, which is why an organization like the FCA, that is a place where you can trust the information that you can that you get there.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned choosing someone who's planning your funeral, or choosing the person who's in charge of your funeral.
Sure.
And I hadn't thought of that before, of like designating someone in advance who would have the right to arrange or organize your funeral. So I was curious about that.
Sure. So I'll clarify what I said a little bit in just a second. So it would be the person that you authorize to pay for your funeral, and they may be the person that you authorize to make your funeral arrangements. Most states have in their statutes the duties, a specified list in order of who is responsible for making the arrangements to provide for a funeral or other disposition of a person who dies. And it almost always will start with the person that they're married to. So it would fall to the surviving spouse unless they were not legally separated or legally divorced. If they're legally separated or legally divorced, that is not the person who has the right and the responsibility to do that. In Arizona, if the spouse is not going to do it for some reason, perhaps you're not married, or perhaps your spouse is unable to. So you have to be willing and able. So you may have a spouse who's incapacitated, not able to perform some of these responsibilities. In Arizona, you can designate that the person who has your medical power of attorney can be the person who is responsible for carrying out your instructions if you've left them, or making arrangements if you haven't. Nobody is required to do something that is completely unaffordable or unreasonable in some way, but they're expected to follow your wishes to the best of their ability. So if it's not the spouse, not the power of attorney, if the person is a minor, it would fall to their parents. It would fall to the adult children of the person who's died, and so on down the list. It can include even a grandparent if it's a family that has few members in it. It conceivably could be a grandparent. Sometimes it falls on the person who has authority to dispose of the dead person's body. So, for example, that might relate to somebody who's in the military and who has filled out a particular Department of Defense form that specifies who will take care of their body in case of their death. Again, if none of the above and the person is incarcerated, the authority that has a incarcerated them would have the responsibility. And so it's specified, there's a list, people can go out. One of the easiest ways to find out what is the rule in their state is to go to nolo.com. It's I think it's a .com. I don't think it's a .org. It's a legal resources site. And it's pretty easy to just look there as, who's responsible for, who has burial responsibility in Georgia, something like that, and you'll easily be able to find. But the statute in Arizona is really pretty straightforward and easy to read, and it's a really logical order. But some of the challenges come in when there's multiple siblings and perhaps disagreements about how things should be done. And so my hat's off to the funeral directors who navigate not only just the tenderest time in a family's life, but also when there is contention or dysfunction. They are pretty amazing people, funeral directors.
So can you designate the person you want to be in charge of your funeral arrangements if you choose, and maybe someone that doesn't fall within that
in Arizona,
hierarchy?
yes, you can designate the person who has your healthcare power of attorney. There is, I'm just looking at it here. The people who it would fall to may sign a waiver of decision that waives their rights. But now we're getting into the point of interpreting the law and not giving legal advice. So if you have any question or any concern about this, it's a really good idea to check with an attorney. There are some folks for whom their family relationships are strained in some way, shape, or form, and this would pose some real challenges for them. If that's the case, where you would not want someone in your family to have responsibility for you when you die, I would seek legal counsel to help you navigate that. And I do have a little bit of a story about this. So this starts with, if the dead person was married, it falls to the surviving spouse unless they're legally separated. We're familiar with a situation where a gentleman died. He had been married, but had never actually divorced. But he had a family that he called his own, that were the folks that he was closest to, and they were making his funeral arrangements for him when they presumably had notified his ex-wife, who wasn't his ex-wife, that he had died, and she stepped in to make his funeral arrangements and made a very different set of plans than what the folks who were closest to him knew that he wanted. So the moral of that story is finish what you start.
So, yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I also wondered if I have been in situations where the person who has died has said, I don't have a funeral for me. I don't want a funeral. And yet the survivors, the family members, feel that they need to have a funeral or a memorial. And I wasn't sure if there's any kind of legal implication there, if the family still wants to go ahead and do something to have some sort of a ceremony, but it violates the wishes of the loved one who has died.
My understanding is that the expectation is that when practical, you follow the person's wishes, whether that is really an enforceable, whether it is covered in the law and whether or not it's enforceable in some way, that's past my ability to speak to. There was something I wanted that you made me think that I wanted to mention there. I would, if I was having a conversation with somebody about that, what I would ask them is there some way for you to both honor this person's wishes and meet your needs, perhaps through some way to memorialize them that respects both needs? So for example, could you have a special if they have a need for a religious service, could you have a religious service that was a memorial for this person in a way that met your spiritual needs and also still respected what this person's wishes were. But that's a tricky spot for people. And that's why writing it down, sharing it with the people who are the ones you most need to know, because of needing to know what you want and what you don't want, having conversations ahead of time and working through those things is really, it's your best bet. And those are tricky spots.
Yeah. So even whether you want everything or nothing on either end of that spectrum, it's good to let people know what it is that you want, so they understand that.
Right. Yep.
Well, what happens if someone has no family, which was the case of one of our patients in hospice? He had no one, and so no survivors to speak for his body even, or his remains after he died. And I'm just curious about what happens in those cases.
So I can think that there might be two sets of circumstances that could come into play here. One is, is there someone who exhibited special care or concern for that person? That's actually the wording in the Arizona statute. Is there a person, the next one down, is there a person who was acting as a guardian of the person at the time of their death? So my sister twice has been friends with two different women who were significantly older than her, who had no surviving family. They had never married, didn't have children, had no living nieces or nephews. And Phyllis was one of a couple of folks who were good friends with these ladies and who helped them navigate their aging and their transitions in their living situations, looked after them, made sure that they had an advocate when they were in the hospital. So I believe Phyllis or another friend was had the medical power of attorney for them, which does not automatically give you the right to make the funeral arrangements. And because she had acted in that capacity, she was able to make the funeral arrangements for her friend at the time of her death. And it was also something that they had talked about, so she had enough to go on as to what was wanted. But there is those two categories: an adult who exhibited special care and concern, or next down is the person who was acting as the guardian of the person at the time of their death. So I don't know if that might have applied. If that was not the situation, and the person, so I don't know if hospices, you might know, how was it handled? Do you remember?
Well, he had been homeless, and so we took care of him. We were able to get a tiny apartment where we were able to care for him at the end of his life. And he became a ward of the state, I believe, at the time of his death, and was cremated and would have been buried in a pauper's grave. Is what I understood. But our hospice ended up speaking up for him, and we took his ashes and had a ceremony and buried his ashes for him, because he had no one else who would do that for him. But
well, so I'll bring up another slide here in just a minute, but in Arizona and many states, the indigent burial, which you referred to as, use the word pauper, they are typically, the counties have responsibility in a lot of states, and in Arizona, for making the arrangements to have the person cremated or buried, and then everything is done at the simplest, least cost level. There's no visitation or anything like that. So even you hospice folks in that kind of a situation wouldn't have had any kind of gathering at a funeral home or anything like that. It's just very, very pragmatic the way it's done. But this is maybe a good time for me to share some information about how to cover the cost of cremation, burial, or other disposition of human remains. So I'm going to bring that up here in just a second. So one of the things that comes into play is, are you seeing just the covering the cost slide, Karen?
Yes.
So funeral costs are an expense of the estate. So if there is money in the estate, it's one of the very first bills that gets paid before the credit card bills, before the mortgage, before anything else. The disposition is an expectation to be paid from the estate. So again, if you have somebody who's maybe going to upfront the money, and this obviously doesn't apply to your dear friend there from hospice, but if somebody has the money to front it, then the money can be reimbursed out of the estate. If the person is a veteran, there's the veteran's burial allowance, not a funeral, but a burial allowance. And in the federal cemeteries, the veteran and their spouse can be buried, and in state cemeteries, the veteran and sometimes the spouse can be buried in where you don't have to pay for the grave, because the grave is oftentimes another big expense. When you saw those figures earlier when I showed burial, that's actually before the cost of the grave and before the cost of the outer burial container that keeps the grave from collapsing, because those numbers are just really hard to get a hold of. FEMA still has the financial assistance for COVID-related deaths. They'll pay reimburse up to $9,000. So that covers quite a lot if that's the extent that you want to go. I talked about the payable on death account. Some employers or unions will have in their benefits package some funeral assistance. If you have life insurance, that may be a source depending on how the beneficiary is set up. Victims compensation programs, when someone dies as a result of a crime that was committed. Again, those are often managed by the counties in a lot of states. I believe in Arizona that's the case. There is a Social Security lump sum death payment. I can't remember if it's $225 or $255, so it's not very much. But when you think back to a direct cremation that costs about $550, it goes a long way toward a direct cremation. I know some folks who chose to have plan to have their body donated to science because there is no cost to the disposition of the body there. You want to make sure that whatever organization you make those plans with, that you understand what they will and won't do, and understand that depending on the organization's purpose and what they need the body for, depending on the condition of the body at time of death, they may decline to accept the body, and so there still may be a need to pay for some disposition. There are some charities and nonprofits, particularly ones that help when a child has died. There is sometimes some money available there. We used to see fundraisers in Tucson. I used to see this all the time. On a Saturday morning, driving around town, and there would be a group of teenagers holding a car wash and holding up signs that they were raising money to pay for someone's funeral. And that was very visible, and it just broke my heart every time I saw it. And that's one of the reasons this work is so important to me is, there are a lot of things that come into taking care of somebody when they died and taking care of their family. So it's not like it's just the $545 to have the body cremated. There's still a lot going on for a family. And, if somebody's out of work because they're not ready to go back to work after their loved one died, there can be lost wages and all of that. That's become less visible on the street and has transitioned more into things like online GoFundMe's and things like that. So fundraisers is not still not unusual. And then indigent burial, which we talked about just a little bit ago. But again, Funeral Consumers Alliance just really highly recommends not pre-paying, but pre-planning is what our recommendation is.
This is so good to know that there may be so many different options of finding a way to pay those expenses. And again, such a good resource for people. Another thing I've been curious about is what happens if someone dies who's traveling, maybe out of state, but particularly if they're traveling outside the country. How does that end up getting handled?
Sure, that's an interesting, that's a great question because it happens a lot. In Arizona, for example, two circumstances are not unusual at all. One is snowbirds. There are people from the north, all in Arizona right now, out of the cold. It's the Arctic blast is doing its thing in the north right now, and so do they intend to be returned home at the time of their death? And if they are, in terms of cost, cremation is going to be less expensive because it's much less expensive to transport about a 6 or 7 pound box than it is a whole body. It's much more complicated. If that's what the person's desire is, cremation, then be cremated in place. And then cremated remains, that's the final disposition of human remains. There is very little that controls what happens to remains other than your own choice once a body's been cremated. However, if you need to ship those remains, the post office will ship them, but the other carriers, if they know that's what's in the package, they will decline to ship cremated remains. Funeral directors are well versed in working between two facilities that may be far apart. They do this all the time. When it comes to the other circumstance in Arizona is that a lot of people in Arizona wish to be have their body returned, or their remains returned to Mexico, where they're from, where their family, where they consider their family home to be. So there's a process for doing that, and I pulled that up to have that handy. So I'm just going to kind of look at a couple of things. Again, funeral homes are really well versed in doing this. If they're in Arizona, they probably know, but it's a good question to ask is, how many bodies do you repatriate a year? Well, we did one last year. You might want to go to somebody who's done that, some more. But the funeral home that you work with will contact the Mexican embassy to inform them of your plans, what you want to do, and to be sure that the funeral home is following all the current and correct procedures. So there's going to be similar with other countries, but this is how it works with the U.S. and Mexico. You'll need to select a receiving funeral home in that other country if the body is going to be returned. And again, the U.S. funeral home can typically help with that. There are certain documents that you have to get, the birth certificate or proof of the nationality of the person. In the case of Mexico, you have to have the death certificate with a Spanish translation and something called an apostille, which is, it authenticates a document, so it'll be accepted by a foreign country. The Arizona Secretary of State has a form for that. There's a disposition transit permit for remains or ashes. Translation is required. Interestingly enough, it is legal to return the body in your own vehicle to Mexico, but you have to have done all this other stuff. You don't have to have the funeral home transport the body, but you do have to have all of the permits and all those things that you need. And then you may need an official statement from the coroner if the death certificate doesn't include it. So bottom line is that funeral homes are typically going to be well versed in this if they're in an area where there is a lot of this kind of activity needed, and they should have resources that they can tap into to help someone. Cost standpoint, there's gonna be a lot of cost involved, particularly when the body has to be transported a distance.
Oh, wow, that's good to know. There's just so much information, and I know we're running out of time, but there were other things I wanted to ask, and one was that you mentioned some of the creative memorials that people are doing now instead of traditional funerals, and that might apply to those people who wanted to commemorate a loved one who didn't really want a traditional funeral, because oftentimes that's what people don't want. They want something different. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about that.
Sure. So there's several things that I can think of. One of the most dramatic ones is that you can have cremated remains put into fireworks. It takes about
Mm.
2 tablespoons per rocket to have your remains fired off. Please don't do that in Arizona, in the desert, in the dry. Please don't do that there. um, Other things are and some of these are done, but not necessarily, but there's twists on them. So for example, the memorial video that I put together for my husband, I shared that with people in other means instead of it just being just at the funeral home, which there wasn't one because he died at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So one of the things that we saw was the use of streamed services. That was a difficult decision for me to make because it was very new. The church that we went to had the experience with streamed church services, but this was the first memorial service that they put together, and it required a fair amount of creativity. One piece, someone played one of my husband's guitars and sang David's favorite hymn. So we had that recorded and put into the service. So a lot more pieces and parts there. I've seen, and the stream service brought a lot of people to the service who literally couldn't be there because of the pandemic, but had it not been the pandemic, would not necessarily have traveled, but really appreciated the opportunity to be there with me that day in a way that, just was unheard of before. In the border culture in Arizona, the Day of the Dead, the ofrenda, this is something that's an altar that's put together every year to invite loved ones back. That's certainly a memorial activity, and it's telling people, you've not been forgotten. You've not been forgotten. I still love you. I've not forgotten you. And it teaches it introduces the loved one to the next generation so that when they make their ofrendas, they can invite the ancestors back who they may have never met, but were important to their parents. And so I think that's just a really lovely tradition that is well ingrained in a particular culture and getting to be known more and more through some of the just the spreading of culture throughout the United States. My sister, her husband has passed away, and there have been several things that it was time to let go of them. And so she and a friend, they have a fire pit. And so when there's something that it's time to let go of, they get together, they have a little food, they have a little something to drink, and then they put it in the fire pit and release this thing that it is time to let go of. And that's been a really lovely way for her to be able to deal with some of that kind of stuff. And it's really kind of, another one that I really like is doing something that was important to your loved one or something on their bucket list, maybe inspire your own bucket list. Again, a little brief story of my own. My husband and I used to do what we would take what we referred to as a mural safari around Tucson. We loved the murals that had gotten more and more common there. And we would go out on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon and take pictures. And I don't live in Tucson anymore, but when I go back, I really pay attention to the murals. And it was very difficult for me at first to get out of the car and take a picture, but I can do that now. And I think about him every time. I think that's That's a way of memorializing him. So it's what was important to that person, and how can you call that to mind when it's time.
That's so beautiful. Well, Martha, I just want to thank you. You've shared so much really valuable information that I think everyone needs to know these things, but most of us don't. And so I'm really grateful to you. And I wanted to mention again, the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Arizona website is fcaaz.org, and the National Funeral Consumers Alliance is funerals.org. And you had mentioned, is it possible for, you mentioned people looking in their own state to see if they have an organization, and look up their website. Are there other ways to be involved with the Funeral Consumers Alliance?
Sure. On funerals.org there is a page to find an affiliate, so that's readily available there. On March 18th, the annual meeting of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Arizona will be held. And I'm so delighted that you, Karen, is going to be, you're going to be our speaker, because you're going to be talking about how to have a successful end of life conversation. And our invitation to you was inspired by a cast you did a couple years ago that I referred many people to. So you can attend the annual meetings. That meeting is open to the public, and we'll have the information up on our website very shortly about the date and time for all of that. So that invitation is wide open, and it is going to be a hybrid, so people can attend from near and far to hear you speak. And you're welcome to put my contact information in your cast notes as well.
Oh, thank you. And I'll put a link for that event in March also in the show notes if anyone wants to sign up and join us virtually in March. That would be wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Martha, for giving me your time today. And I feel like we could talk for hours more. Maybe we will. We'll have to do another podcast in the near future.
That would be great. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really important to me to get the word out about, when your eyes got big, if you think your eyes get big, so do a lot of other people. It's really, really important for us to share this information and help people through this difficult and tender time.
Definitely. Well, thank you and take care, and I'll see you in March.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
All righty.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Martha Lundgren. I learned so much from her, and I was really shocked at how little I actually knew about funeral expenses, about ways to save money on funerals, and also just the disparity in charges for things like cremation that could exist in one single neighborhood. So I think this is such valuable information, and I hope you learned something as well. And be sure to tell other people about this particular episode in case they could benefit from learning too. So I'll be back the next time with another video for you. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.